going to do is we're going to mark the centers on the bottom of all 4 train case bottom pieces. And to do that, you're going to need your pattern piece. And one piece at a time, you're going to mark these center marks here along the curved edges. And you're always marking centers on the wrong side. And then for the center marks along the straight edges, you can actually use the dotted line on the pattern piece to find the center of those sides. And then you repeat the same thing for the other 3 pieces. Now we're going to mark the centers on our train case gusset and our train case back panel pieces. And to mark these, we're just going to fold them in half and make a center mark on the wrong side along the top and bottom edge. And the same thing for the train case gusset. And you do the same thing for the lining pieces. And then we'll mark the centers on our our zipper compartment pieces. On the exterior pieces, we just need center marks along the top and bottom edges on the wrong side. So you're going to fold in half, right sides together. Mark the center along the top and the bottom. And then I'll do the same thing for the second piece. For the lining piece, I want the center marks on the wrong side first, same as the exterior pieces. And then I also want a center mark on the right side, primarily on the top edge, and that'll be for centering our zipper a little bit later on, but just in case, I'm going to put one on the right side as well. So you're going to repeat that for the other lining piece. The last thing we're going to do before we get to sewing is mark the placement for our handles. So you'll need your zipper compartment pattern piece, and you'll see the little gray box here that says handle placement, and at each of the corners there's a little black dot. So what you'll want to do is punch out that little black dot so you have a hole in your pattern piece. You can use a rotary hole punch if you have that. I'm just using the tip of my seam ripper, or one of my many seam rippers. And to mark the placement, make sure you're using something that is removable, a fabric pen or something that's erasable. I'm just using an erasable white pencil. And then you're just going to transfer the location of those 4 dots to the right side of your zipper compartment exterior piece. And of course, my white is over a white flower, so that's not going to show. So I'm going to use just a regular pencil, and I'll erase that afterwards. So here we go again. Okay, you probably can't see those on video, but I can see them. Then you'll take the pattern piece and you'll just flip it vertically and mark the location on the other side. Again, I'm at a white flower, so I'm going to use this pencil. And then you do the same thing for the second piece. Finally, we're going to get to the sewing part of this bag. What I'd like you to do right now before you continue is to go and switch to the zipper foot on your sewing machine. I know some machines, especially the fancier computerized machines, will have a very wide regular foot. And if you use that foot for the train case assembly, you will have problems sewing with the seam allowance I recommend in the pattern. So before we continue, stop here and go and switch to your zipper foot on your machine. Once you have that zipper foot, we're going to take the train case gusset lining piece and your train case zipper. The train case zipper is either 29 inches of zipper tape or 30-inch pre-made double pull zipper. And you're just going to place the zipper, so you want the lining piece right side facing up and the zipper also right side facing up. And we're just going to place it along the top edge. So if you're using a directional print, you want it at the top. And we're just going to pin or clip that zipper to the top edge. Normally I use clips, but I figure since I'm using Tula Pink fabric, I should use the matching unicorn pins, right? Now once I have this pinned in place, I'm going to go over to the machine and I'm just going to quickly baste the zipper to the lining piece, just with a quick basting stitch, and I'm just going to use 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along this edge. The zipper is now basted to the lining piece. Now we're going to take the train case gusset exterior piece and we're going to place it over top so that the zipper and the lining piece is right side together with the exterior piece. Now if you're using a directional print, in this step, make sure that you're attaching it to the top. I made it easy for myself by using a solid. I'm sort of cheating. But yeah, if you're using a directional print, you want to pay attention to the direction of that print. You don't want to attach it to the bottom. So now we're clipping this together. I'm not using pins this time because I find it a little bit difficult to pin through foam. So I prefer to use clips in this step. Now when you're clipping, it's important to make sure that the shorter edges here are lined up. Okay, you want these to line up at the shorter ends. And we're going to sew all of these layers together along this top edge. This time you're going to use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you're working in metric, that's 10 millimeters. Excuse me. Make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and the end, and you'll want to pull those zipper pulls out of the way. So if you're using zipper tape, make sure that you've sewn across the coil here at the end so you don't accidentally pull your pulls off. That becomes a little bit frustrating to try and get those back on. So we're just going to sew with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance along this top edge, moving the pulls out of the way so that they don't interfere with our stitching. Okay, so now we have the exterior and the lining sewn to the zipper, and we're going to have to press these away from the zipper. But what I like to do, because I do find it a little bit more difficult when you're using foam, is I go along the bottom edge and I just clip those edges together, and then we'll press them. And also, because you have your center marks here, when you're doing this, you can make sure that those stay lined up and that the edges here are lined up. Now this is optional, this is just how I like to do it, but if you like to just go ahead and press, you can do that as well. So now we're going to press. I always like to press from the right side and the wrong side. And now we're going to head back to the machine and we're going to top stitch this seam allowance with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now before I start top stitching, I have put my regular foot back on my machine for the top stitching part. I just find it gives me a lot more control, and if you do that, just make sure that you switch back to your zipper foot for the remainder of the train case assembly parts, which won't be for a little bit. So you can switch to your regular foot, and then I'll give you another reminder when it's time to switch back to the zipper foot. I'm going to use a longer seam allowance, sorry, a longer stitch length. All right, now when you're top stitching, I like to pull on both the exterior and the lining fabric to make sure that I'm keeping them away from the zipper coil, because you don't want them to get caught in the zipper when you're opening and closing your trim case. So I go slowly, section by section, and I just make sure I'm pulling that away from the zipper. Pull these out of the way. So here's the part where it gets a little bit more complicated. You're going to need your trim case back panel lining piece, and you're just going to place that right side up, and then you're going to place one end of your trim case over top so that the lining pieces are right sides together. It doesn't matter if you start with this side or the other side, it won't make a difference. So I'm just going to start with this side because it's going to make the next part, when I show you how to sew it at the machine, it's just going to make it a little bit more clear. but you can start at either end. So you're lining up these edges. I'm going to turn it this way. So we're lining up the edges here so that the lining pieces are aligned. And then you're going to pin or clip. I'm going to use clips here because it's faster. Okay. And don't worry too much if this part doesn't line up, because that will be a hidden end seam allowance later. So I'm just going to use this and hold these in place. Okay, so now we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to start at this bottom edge, and you're going to use the regular seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. You're going to start at the bottom, you're going to backstitch, and then you're going to sew up towards the zipper, and you're going to sew as far as you can get, and then you're going to stop at the zipper, and then you're going to backstitch. So I'm starting at the bottom edge, and I'm going to start by backstitching. And then I'm going to sew up towards the zipper as close as I can get without sewing into the foam. And then when I get to the zipper, I'm going to backstitch again. Now you're going to take the train case back panel exterior piece and you're going to place it so that it is right sides together. With the same end where we attach the lining, you're going to clip this to the exterior. You're not including the lining pieces, you're only sewing the exterior. And I'm just going to put a clip here at the top just so that they stay aligned while I'm sewing. And we're going to go over to the machine, and you're going to pull these out of the way, and you're going to sew from the bottom edge, backstitch, and then again you're sewing as close as you can get to the zipper. When you get to the zipper, you stop, you backstitch again. Okay, so now this is what we have. So we have these two edges attached, these two edges attached, but nothing is attached at the top here. So now what we're going to do is we are going to attach these pieces at the top. So I'm just going to add a clip to make sure that they stay nicely aligned. And this time we're going to be sewing through all of the layers, but only for this short section right here. So you start at the top, you backstitch, and then you sew until you encounter the backstitching from when you sewed up towards your zipper. You stop here and then you backstitch again. All right, so I've sewn this little section here. Now this is what we have. Okay, but these pieces are only attached in sections. So what we want to do now is we want to top stitch the seam allowance, but we don't want to include the lining because we need these pieces to stay unattached for when we attach the train case bottom. So you're going to just kind of tuck them out of the way. If it helps, you can add a little pin, which I have all the way over there. Here we are. So if it helps, you can just pin these out of the way, like so. Okay, and then you're going to press this seam allowance away, and then you're just going to top stitch along this edge here. Make sure that you can backstitch at the beginning and the end just to make sure your top stitching doesn't come undone. But you're just top stitching this seam, and you're not including, you will have to include a little bit of the lining right here. That's okay. You just don't want to include this longer section right here. Okay, this section here has been top stitched, and so I'm just going to take this out now. Okay, this is what it looks like from the wrong side. These are still unattached. Now we're going to repeat these steps, and this is where it'll get a little bit awkward. We need to attach these two ends to the opposite end of our train case gusset. So we're going to repeat the same steps. this part will be easy. We're going to place the other edge, shorter edge of our train case back panel and line it up with only the lining pieces of the train case gusset. And we're going to clip these together. And then once again, we're pushing this out of the way and we're sewing from the bottom edge, backstitching, and getting as close as we can to the zipper, stopping, and then backstitching again. Okay, they are attached, and now we're going to do the same, and we're going to attach this. So here's where you might find it a little awkward, but we're going to flip this because we need these to be right sides together. Okay, so like this, and bring these over like this. And some clips, and then again, this is out of the way, and we're sewing from the bottom edge, backstitching, sewing up towards the zipper, stopping at the zipper, and backstitching again. Now that these are sewn, now it looks like we have a real mess. I promise you it's going to make sense shortly. Now we're doing exactly as we did previously, and we're now going to sew this shorter section here. Just put a clip, so we're sewing through all the layers starting at this top edge, backstitching, and then you're stopping at that stitching and you're backstitching again. The top section is sewn together. And now we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to top stitch the seam allowance here along the exterior layers only, and along this seam allowance here. Once again, I don't want to include the lining pieces in the top stitching, so it'll be a little bit awkward, but you'll want to place it like this, make sure all the lining pieces are out of the way. And then you just backstitch, top stitch along this edge, and then backstitch again. I've top stitched here and here now, and we have something that is beginning to resemble a train case somewhat. Now before we continue, we're going to need to make some more center marks so that we can attach them to the center marks on our train case bottom piece. So right now we do have some marks that we made previously, but we are mostly missing the center mark on the zipper tape and center marks at the ends here and the center marks on the ends over here. So to find our centers, we're going to start, we do have a center mark here, and we are going to also line up these two seams from our train case back panel piece and then just flatten the two, and that'll help us find this center mark. Then if we have these marks meet and then flatten the tube again, that'll give us this mark. And repeat the same thing and find this mark. And then we can do the same thing for these. So I'm lining up the marks, center marks that we already have here, and then closing this, marking here, same thing, line these up, flatten, and mark over here. And then I'm just going to transfer these two to the lining piece as well. So flatten this, this, and then reach in there and the center, and then do the same on this side. And now we should have all the center marks we need to attach the train case bottom pieces. We're now going to attach the train case bottom exterior piece and the train case bottom lining piece that has no fusible fleece to the train case. To do that, we need to start by flipping the exterior and the lining of the train case so that they're both wrong side facing out, like this. And we're going to start by attaching the lining piece only because when we attach the exterior piece, it's going to give the train case some structure, and it just makes it more difficult to attach the lining pieces. So you're going to start by lining up the center mark that's along one of the longer edges of the train case bottom lining piece, and you're going to match that up with the center mark that is on the train case back panel lining piece. I'm going to flip that around, and then the center mark on the opposite longer edge is going to be lined up and clipped to the center front of the train case. And then we're going to line up these center marks of the curved edges to the marks on the sides. And then once we've got our center marks matched up, then we're going to clip the rest. So I'll just show you one portion and then I'll finish the rest off camera. Now, I mentioned in the instructions that we're going to clip some of the seam allowance along these curved corners, and I'm actually going to do that at the machine because I want to show you how that helps with sewing those curves. So for now, I'm just going to clip, and then at the machine I'm going to show you how I clip some notches inside the within the seam allowance here so that everything sits nice and flat along these curved corners. Now, when we're attaching the train case bottom lining piece, I usually start sewing at one of the longer straight edges, close to one of the center marks. And because we're sewing a lining piece, we're not going to use the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're actually going to increase that to 1/2 inch. And have a pair of scissors ready because we're going to be clipping into that seam allowance like I mentioned previously. And it's much easier if that train case bottom is on the bed of your machine. Okay, so we're getting close to a curved corner, and you'll see how the train case gusset part wants to sort of flip up, but the train case bottom lining is lying nice and flat. So what I actually do is I just trim here only on the train case gusset piece, and when you clip into the seam allowance, it helps it to lie flat. And so I'm going to keep clipping so that, again, it helps it to lie flat. If you notice it starting to pucker here, just press down on those puckers with your fingers and it will help flatten them. You have to stop a lot and lift your foot and reposition. Again, I'm just going to clip a little bit. Don't rush through this part. Take your time to avoid any mistakes. And then just continue sewing the rest of the train case bottom to the train case gusset, making sure that you're clipping the seam allowance in the gusset when you get to these curved corners. As you can see, I have the train case bottom lining attached, and if you look inside, you can see, thanks to the notches that I made in the seam allowance, there is no puckers or anything in the seam. We're going to do the same thing for the train case bottom. And if you're wondering how we're going to be turning this, we're going to be turning it through this opening that we left along the top. So this is where the train case back panel is located. So now we're going to repeat exactly what we've just done, but this time we're sewing the train case bottom exterior piece. And again, you're going to start by lining up one of the longer sides of the train case bottom with the center mark that is at the top of the, or rather the bottom edge of the train case back panel. And then you're doing the opposite center mark, and then the sides. And we're going to, again, you're repeating exactly the same thing that you've just done to attach the lining piece. You're going to go over to your machine and sew with the train case bottom on the bed of your machine, and at the corners you can clip into the seam allowance if you need to. The only thing you need to remember is that you're not using a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. You're using the regular 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, if you're using metric measurements, make sure that you look at the instructions in the pattern for each step, where I do give you the seam allowance in millimeters as opposed to inches. So I'm going to go ahead and finish clipping and then sew the bottom to the gusset exterior. So now I have the bottom exterior attached and the lining attached. Before we turn this right side out, we need to trim our seam allowance, because if we leave this seam allowance, it's going to create a lot of bulk at the edges of the train case. Now be careful that you're not cutting any stitches. I usually leave a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch in the seam allowance. I've trimmed the seam allowance on both the lining and the exterior. So now we're going to use this opening to flip the train case right side out. Every time I try to turn a bag on video, it's always much more difficult than when I'm not on video, probably because I'm trying to be careful. Okay, so here we go. Now, at the very end, I like to press my bag, the whole bag, but at this stage I also like to press because I want to check the fit of the train case lining inside the exterior, just to make sure that I'm happy with the seam allowance I took on the lining. And if you want to make any changes, now's the time. You can flip it back and increase your seam allowance. I'm going to get my iron and just give it a quick press to make sure that I'm happy. Okay, so I gave this a quick press and I'm fairly happy with the results. Since we won't be turning this anymore, you can actually line up those center marks that are at the top of our train case back panels, and you can just do a quick basting stitch here to close this opening with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so I've basted this opening shut, and we're going to set aside the train case for now. And we are going to put together the train case zipper pocket. So for this, you're going to need the pocket binding piece, your 2 mesh pieces for the pocket top and bottom, and your 4 zipper tab pieces, and your 12-inch zipper. We're going to start by pressing our pocket binding piece. So we're going to press this so that we're creating a double fold piece of binding that is 1/2 inch wide. So first we start by pressing in half, wrong sides together along the entire length. Then we're going to open this piece up and we're going to fold 1/2 towards that center crease in the middle, wrong sides together, and then the other half. And then you fold again along that original center crease, fold in half again so that the raw edges are hidden inside, and give it another press. Once you've pressed your binding piece along the entire length to create a 1/2 inch wide double fold binding piece, we're going to cut this into 2 14-inch pieces. So now you should have 2 pieces that are 14 inches long by 1/2 inch wide. Now you'll want to take your zipper pocket upper piece and your zipper pocket lower piece, and you're going to take the piece of binding. First we're going to start with the lower piece, and you're going to open it up to reveal those raw edges in the center, and you're going to place the top edge of your lower piece, the mesh piece, inside the binding. You want the top edge to be right at the center of that binding piece. And I'm going to use a lot of clips to hold it in place. If you're worried about the piece of mesh coming out, you could use a wash away tape or even a tiny bit of fabric glue and let it dry. I do find the mesh a little bit tricky to sew with. So once you have the upper edge of the the zipper pocket lower piece, we're going to do the same for the upper piece, except this time we're putting the bottom edge inside the binding piece. So you're going to open it all the way and make sure that your mesh goes right down to the center, and clip it in place, same as you did for this piece. Once you have the binding pieces attached to the mesh pieces, we're now going to sew these in place, and you're going to use a shorter stitch length because there is a huge gap here in the mesh. You want to make sure that you're actually catching it in your seam, and you're only going to sew across on the inside edges of the binding. So on the lower piece, you're sewing along the bottom here where there is the opening of the binding piece. So you're sewing all the way across. For the zipper pocket top piece, you're again sewing on the inside edge, this edge over here. So but this time if you're looking at it in this direction, you'd be sewing along the top edge here of the binding piece, and make sure you're using a shorter stitch length. I've now attached the binding pieces, and try to show you this. I did use a contrasting thread, so hopefully you can see this. and I used a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, which I forgot to mention. So we're just going to set these aside. And you're going to need your 12-inch zipper and your zipper tabs. So now we're going to attach zipper tabs at both ends of our zipper. And you're going to take one zipper tab and have it right side facing up, and then put your zipper on top, also right side facing up, and then take a second zipper tab and place it so that it is wrong side facing up. And now your zipper and the zipper tab are right sides together. And you're going to use a pin to hold these in place. You can use clips as well if you prefer. And then we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to sew this in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance from this edge here, from the end of the zipper. So you're going in 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and the end. Once you have the zipper tabs attached to the end of the zipper, we're going to flip them so they are wrong sides together, and we're going to press them away from the zipper. And then we're going to top stitch the seam allowance here with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so these two zipper tabs are attached, and I also like to do a little basting stitch at the end so that I make sure that these edges of the zipper tabs stay together. Now we're going to repeat exactly the same thing, and we're going to sew the 2 remaining zipper tabs to the other end of the zipper. So we're repeating exactly the same steps to attach these. I cannot pin through this pressing mat. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat those same steps. Now we're going to attach the zipper pocket upper piece and the zipper pocket lower piece to our zipper. I say just to center it in the instructions, but if you really like to be extremely precise, you can always mark centers. But I did give these measurements with a little bit of flexibility, so if you're not really precise, you don't have to worry, it will still work. I gave a little bit flexibility just because sometimes the mesh can be a little bit tricky to work with, so I wanted to make it a little bit easier. And then the zipper, okay. All right, so now I'm going to place this over top, and you want to leave a gap between the edge of the binding piece and the edge of the zipper coil here of about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch. It really won't make too much of a difference as long as you're not attaching it too close to the edge of the zipper tape. And you have to really try to be consistent with the spacing between the edge of the binding and the edge of the zipper coil, I should say. So you're attaching the upper piece to the upper part of the zipper tape, if we're thinking upper and lower. Okay, and when we're attaching this, we're going to sew along the bottom folded edges of the binding to attach it to the zipper with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and push that zipper pull out of the way, just so that when you're sewing by the zipper that you don't have the pull in the way. You want that pull out of the way because it does make the zipper tape go out at the location, and I want the spacing to be consistent along the entire length. It will just look nicer in the end. Once you've attached the pocket top binding, you're repeating exactly the same step, and you're going to attach this edge, this folded edge of this piece of binding to the other side of your zipper. Follow exactly the same steps as I did for the top piece. Once you have the two mesh pieces attached to your zipper, you're going to need the remaining train case bottom lining piece, but this one has the fusible fleece on the wrong side. And you're going to place this over top, and I placed it so that the long edge is on one of the lines of the cutting mat. And then I want the top edge here. I want the top edge of this binding piece to be approximately 1.5 inches from this top edge. If you attach things incorrectly, you can put it a bit lower, as long as you have it at the same distance from this edge all along the entire length of the binding piece. So once you're happy with your placement, you can pin that in place. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that there's an equal amount of zipper tab at each end. So you may have to move it over. And it doesn't have to be exact, but you want it to be as precise as possible. Use the lines, the grid lines on your mat to help you with the placement. Okay. All right, so now that I'm happy with the placement, I'm just going to start by pinning the zipper tab ends to that lining piece underneath. Okay, and then you have two options. You can actually go ahead and pin the rest of the mesh all the way around and then do a quick basting stitch to hold it in place. If you want, you can also trim it right now so that it matches the edges of the train case lining piece. I tend to just go ahead and just pin it, and you're going to have to use a lot of pins because of the holes in the mesh. To make sure that you're holding the mesh down, you're going to need to use a lot of pins. If you prefer clips, then you would probably need to trim because you need to grab the edges of both the lining piece and the mesh. So lots of pins. The mesh does have a tendency to shift when you're doing the basting, so the more pins you put, the better it'll be. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead over to the machine, and I'm going to do a quick basting stitch with 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. I do find if your machine has, you can adjust the pressure of your presser foot, it's better to use less pressure in this stage to avoid your mesh getting skewed and really moving around. Once you have your mesh pocket basted to your lining piece, we're now going to just trim the excess all the way around. Okay, and now we can set this aside while we sew up our zipper compartment. Join me for part 3, where we sew up our zipper compartment and complete the final assembly of our bag.